I think we're going to have to move on in the interest of time because we started late. Professor Cummings, are you ready? Yes, your talk. Okay. Professor Emanuel Cummings is the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Academic Engagement at the University of Guyana. Here in Georgetown, Professor Cummings has extensive experience in university administration, having successfully pioneered the transformation of the College of Medical Sciences, University of Guyana, while serving as its dean. He was a Fulbright Scholar, is a full member of the British Physiological Society and the Health Systems Global Program, as well as an eminent medical researcher. His research focuses on nutritional management of diabetes, cancer, and eye care. Professor Cummings is widely recognized for his intelligent and enthusiastic leadership and willingness to make things happen that invariably enhances the academic standing and international collaborations with the University of Guyana. He is co-chair with Professor Helen Herman of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the Columbia University of Guyana Research and Injury and Trauma Training Program. Oh, great.
Before doing that, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. As noted, I'm currently a professor of molecular medicine and genetics at the University of Guyana. On suicide, thanks to Christina, that I've been looking at genetics of cancer and all of that. But as you can see from the previous presentation, and an understanding of genetics can be applied across the board in any condition. So my presentation is not a research, it's not my work. It's based on the literature review for us to have some insights as to, as we look at all of the mitigating factors that can contribute to suicide, look at the genetic component and see what relationship that can have with respect to suicide ideation, suicide attempt, and complete suicide. So it's basically looking at the literature, look at the work that has been done for centuries, and this is something that's been researched since the 18th century. The issue of genetics and suicide, and all the way to current, and to look across all of that, and to see exactly if there is anything that we can use to help us in identifying risk factors, so that we can be in a better position to detect very early and risk for suicide, and how we can then have the kinds of intervention. So I just use this to scroll. And as I said, to provide a relationship between genetic predisposition and suicidal behavior, a review of the literature. And so in trying to link genetics with suicide, there are different kinds of studies that have been done to provide or to somehow instigate that sort of relationship. Now, we know genes runs in families. And so one of such studies there, I'm trying to move this thing here, are family studies. Rolling it is supposed to be moving. Can you just move it?
Maybe it's just the scroll wheel.
Right. As I said earlier, genetic factors, and suicidal behavior, and they can be relevant from suicide ideation, the whole idea of wanting to commit suicide, attempts, completed suicide, and based on the literature, it seems to suggest there is a genetic susceptibility in each aspect of the whole spectrum of looking at suicide. I must say that in terms of suicide ideation, there seems to be not much genetic relation. The other side I have to screw.
No. Yeah.
That's
Don't use the buttons. Just use the.
well, I was using the wheels now moving. I'm using the buttons now moving. Supposed to move with the wheel. Okay. Suavemente. Right. So family studies. So lots of family studies, looking at family, victims to see if one relative would have committed suicide, to indicate that if someone is committed suicide in the family, to see if there's a relationship that for us to observe the offsprings. And several studies have shown a higher rate of suicidal behavior in relatives of suicide victims or attempters compared to relative to non-suicidal control. Some work in Denmark also report increased rates of suicide in offspring of suicidal parents compared to offspring of non-suicidal parents. So it seems to indicate, however, suicide rates of individuals who lost their parents' suicide were higher compared to individuals who lost their parents in homicides or accidents. Now, this is deliberate to persons may feel that because of grief, you may want to commit suicide because you may lose your parent through accident or you may lose them through suicide. But what the actual literature is showing, that losing a parent through suicide is a greater risk that the child or the offspring want to commit suicide as against if you lose a parent from any other reason. Again, looking at in the case of adolescent suicide victims, found an increased rate of suicide attempts in first-degree relatives, right? They share 50% of the genes, as compared to persons who have to controls where there is no relation. The study also reported increased rate of suicide attempts or completion in families of suicide completers, right? So persons who have completed suicide, they also strong evidence that their relatives are more likely to commit suicide. Several studies also suggest the existence of a common suicide phenotype that includes both attempt and completion. So there seems to be some genetic relationship between attempters and those who completed suicide. As I did indicate, that the ideation, suicide ideation seems to come from a different genetic relationship. So in summary, suicide ideation is the contrast may present as a separate phenotype, as which I said earlier. Evidence that inheritance of suicidal behavior includes both suicide attempts and suicide completion. Familial transmission may be independent of that of psychiatric disorders. So, because sometimes you may want to think that the other depression, other psychiatric issues that might have contributed to these offspring committing suicide. However, there seems to be a disassociation between having a psychiatric disorder, which were purely due to genetic factors. Another way of evaluating, so you look at family studies, you look at twin studies, and they looked at monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins. Now, what the literature is saying, and we know what are, for those who are not, may not know, a monozygotic twin is a twin that shares one egg, one sperm, and it forms two individuals. Whereas dizygotic, it's two different sperm and two different eggs. The monozygotic are referred to the identical twins, and the dizygotic are non-identical. And again, there's few studies on monozygotic concordance of a rate of 5.6%, 1 in 18, as against 0. And so it shows clearly the closer the genetic relation, the greater the risk of committing wanting to commit suicide. However, there seems to be some, and the whole, when you look at the literature, it's very conflicting to some extent, because some studies have reported the other way around, where there was a greater incidence in dizygotic as against monozygotic. However, most of the studies are actually showing that a closer relationship among monozygotic twins as against two dizygotic twins. Twin studies again, 10 of 26 surviving monozygotic co-twins had attempted suicide. None of the 9 surviving dizygotic twins had a history of suicide attempts. And so again, the genetics is showing of that close relation, suggesting that suicide attempts and completion may share a common genetic component as against to suicide ideation, right? Idea wanting to commit suicide, there seems to be a different genetic relationship against completers and attempts. So observations. Investigators consistently found that psychiatric diagnosis as being an underlying factor.
Back up one slide.
Oh, yes.
Sorry, okay, no, it's the went to the next slide. The adoption studies.
So the adoption studies next slide.
Oh, sorry.
So observation.
That's please carry on.
It's not
The observations.
observations.
Sorry.
Stadium. Right. Investigators consistently found that psychiatric diagnosis as being underlying major depressive and some of the disorders concerning major depression disorder, conduct disorder, anxiety disorder, and alcoholic dependence. And also issue of environmental factors. The previous speaker spoke about epigenetics and what role the environment can play in the change of our genes. As with family studies, twin studies support a genetic basis of suicidal behavior. The genetic component of suicidal behavior may be independent of heritability or psychiatric disorders. So, which I was earlier, that's kind of isolated. Now, in terms of adoption, and I will quickly summarize this. And again, there is some sort of relationship. There is no relationship. You're adopted into a family that there's no risk that you will commit suicide. And studies have actually shown that, even though you may share the same environmental factors, but you don't share the genes. And so that again strengthens the theory that there's a genetic side of suicide in relation to adoption studies. Now, if we look at the genes themselves, now just quickly look at serotonin metabolism, because a lot of the studies that are being done with respect to genetic to implicate the genes and suicide surrounds the metabolism of serotonin. We have here a full explanation of serotonin, which is produced from the amino acid tryptophan. The first step, that enzyme tryptophan hydroxylase. Now, all of these enzymes that are listed here have been studied. The one that is mostly studied is tryptophan hydroxylase, because in that first step, we produce L-hydroxytryptophan, which then decarboxylates to produce serotonin. And as I said, for this discussion, I only focus on the tryptophan hydroxylase, but the literature speaks about mutations in all of those enzymes which are involved in serotonin metabolism, because we all know the role of serotonin in our mood, in relation to do with stress, and all the other issues which can prelude or can predispose one to suicide. So trying to understand suicide of itself, we look at serotonin metabolism and see if there are mutations, if there are genetic predisposition with respect to the enzymes, which in turn can affect the levels of serotonin and therefore can have an impact on stress and the whole issue of wanting to commit suicide. And so as I said, the tryptophan hydroxylase The two isoforms, there are two genes. You have the tryptophan hydroxylase 1 and 2, because the two isoforms of the enzyme, meaning that they catalyze the same substrate, but the two different forms of the enzyme, tryptophan hydroxylase 1 and tryptophan hydroxylase 2. Now, tryptophan hydroxylase 1, that is located both in the brain, the central nervous system, as well as the peripheral nervous system. Tryptophan hydroxylase 2 is more located in the CNS. Now, in terms of the location, tryptophan hydroxylase 1 is located in chromosome 11, and tryptophan hydroxylase 2, the gene is located in chromosome 12. And what the studies, literature is showing, there is some sort of polymorphism within the tryptophan hydroxylase 1. Polymorphism meaning that there are genetic differences among individuals. And so that may be responsible. So if you acquired a mutation, you have, and it's really, the introns, you know, which are the non-coding regions of the DNA introns. There's where you have the mutations, and which somehow seems to contribute to the differences in the behavior of the tryptophan hydroxylase, and because of the difference in terms of the sequence of the end product, you know, a protein is a product of the gene, and so the end product, which is the enzyme, and that would have started, you know, a lot of work to look at the literature, looking at the messenger RNA and all of the different genetic predisposition which responds rather in different forms of the enzyme, and that by itself, there seems to be strong association, right, in terms of serotonin metabolism, because once you have a mutation in a particular enzyme, the gene, it affects the enzyme, and so that will somehow have a relationship between the levels of serotonin in those individuals, and which can be responsible for some of those behaviors that can predispose one to suicide, and in addition to some environmental factors which can also contribute. What some of these studies have also shown that, again, there's some underlying psychiatric disorders, you know, and so we cannot state clearly if it's purely the polymorphism which is contributing to the levels to suicidal behavior, and indeed it is contributing to levels of serotonin, but is it really that alone? And so, you know, genetic studies, even though they've been going on for about 2 centuries now, there's still much more to be done in terms for us to really truly, but there's some indication that there is some sort of a relationship, and we should really take much note of that. Now, the tryptophan hydroxylase 2, as I said, there is very conflicting results. Some researchers support a strong relationship, and some said no, and so it is for us to continue that kind of role. So in general, there seems to be a genetic environment interaction, epigenetics, which can somehow influence our genetic predisposition. Suicidal behavior is considered to be a complex phenotype that involves both genetic predisposition and environmental factors. We cannot ignore the environmental factors. Personal history of childhood abuse has been repeatedly implicated as a risk factor for suicidal behavior. Several epidemiological studies have estimated that sexual abuse may explain 20% of the risk of variance in suicide. So even though you're predisposed to something, what happens if you're predisposed to the mutation, but if you're exposed to childhood abuse or any stressful condition as a child, it increases your risk of one to commit suicide. So we cannot, because unless we do genetic studies in everybody, which, you know, but it seems to be the factor that once persons have exposed during childhood, there's increased risk of that mutation being manifested. Experience carrying some genetic predisposition and who experienced childhood during 8 years. Treat 11 of age. Maltreatment or increasing number of stressful life events between 12 and 6 of age were more prone to suicidal ideation or attempt. So also depends on the time of the age when you're exposed to these environmental factors. Similar findings of increased risk of patients who had experienced physical or sexual and childhood trauma. So all of these factors, as we said, they interplay between the genetics or genes rather and the environment. Conclusion. Family, twin, and adoption studies have established a genetic basis of suicidal behavior. Suicide candidate gene studies have been plagued by inconsistent findings. Genes should be studied more comprehensively. Analyzing coding of unpromoted polymorphism, Dr. Becquerel, you have a lot of work to do to assess the role in suicidal behavior and related phenotypes. And suicide remains a complex phenotype with multiple contributing factors by both environment and genetic. And so that's what I just wanted to say to you. The oil was basically the same. That there is some indication that genetic factors do contribute, but there is still the role of the environment. We still have to separate the underlying psychiatric disorders so as to purely say, well, look, genetic factors are really responsible. Twin studies, adoption studies, family studies have shown some sort of relationship, but also we also have to be mindful of what children are exposed to, because a lot of these manifestations that happen later in life could be based on what the type of environment these kids are exposed to in early life, which can contribute to the risk of wanting to commit suicide. Thank you very
much. Professor Cummings, another interesting talk and very relevant, I think, to Dr. Becquerel's work, your discussion of the early childhood experiences. It seems like a seriously uphill battle, as obviously such a gene would be terminal. My own observation was I felt the adoption studies would be the strongest because we know that there's a lot of copycat behavior of suicide, and the other studies didn't seem, at least in your overview, didn't seem to address that. Questions?
We're talking about the predisposition to suicide. Even and bring in the previous speaker's information, the manipulation of their genes and concern and so on. So there's a family member somewhere in my history that would have committed suicide, and now I'm predisposed. What then can I do, having this information, to prevent that from happening? My second question, let me finish off at the top. Do we then start with or think about helping our children or teens with coping mechanisms as a normal curriculum activity so that if we experience some sort of abuse or trauma as children, we are able, because we would have been taught coping mechanisms, to deal with that. Is that something that might work? And my second question has to do with socialization. Copycatting was mentioned a bit ago. In my experience as a social worker, when there are issues of suicide in the family, it's mentioned often, especially with the children of that person. So, oh, your dad committed suicide, your mom. So you hear this throughout your life. So now when I'm faced with trauma, I'm faced with difficult situations, this is the way out.
That's true. I can tell you, very close relative of mine, I'm trying to get him to come to the university to study. Got his C-Sec. And the parents are saying, no, don't push the boy. His grandfather committed suicide. So we don't want him to commit suicide. So that what you're saying is real. It happens, you know? And so the point is that we have to, I think our intervention is late. And I think our intervention should be from nursery school. You know, I think that's where we need to have our social workers. Our social workers are located in ministry. They shouldn't be there. They should be out in the fields working. They should be in the nursery schools. We put them in the high schools where they're already been exposed to trauma, to abuse, to all kinds of issues without reporting it between 5 and 6. You know, and so and that's something that I've been saying all the time. We have to identify these behaviors very early, and nursery school, play school, there is where, you know, as I often say, a little 3-year-old boy that pushes a 3-year-old girl is an abuser 20 years down the line. You know, that's where it starts, you know. You know, and so I think that is the sort of approach that we have in terms of providing support, and our comment should be quite positive. I fully agree with you. I mean, in this family case where no, we can't push the boy because the father, the grandfather committed suicide. You know, I don't want you to commit suicide, and so we need to look at, you know, look at the positive sides. And many times our relationship or interactions is very negative, and which permeates the kind of behavior. And so it's a behavioral change, not only for the victim, but we ourselves, as parents, as academics, in any environment where we have to permeate the positive thoughts, because the negative thoughts, you know, can somehow bring out the kind of results that you're looking for, which we don't really want to.
So we have started to train teachers, nurse school teachers, primary school teachers, secondary school teachers, on how to identify behavioral problems in children. So our surveillance for these behavioral problems, we have increased it. And regards to the trauma, it tells us as psychiatrists who's at risk and who needs increased surveillance by teachers, by relatives, and so forth.
Brief question.
2 questions. We have a challenge where some of the more practical aspects of genetics, we, the population, and even some of us who are academics, not aware of. There's still a fairly large proportion of people of African descent who know very little about sickle cell disease and its inheritance, number 1. I lived in a country years ago where parents were advertising for their sons and daughters-in-law, arranged marriages. And we thought, we being under the British influence, thought that was something to laugh about. But after about 3 months, I wished I could influence my children's choice, because the parents, I want the best for my son and my daughter. And I wouldn't like my son, my daughter, to marry somebody who has a history of suicide or something else. What do we do in 2022 when we have such a large proportion of our population smoking the weed, alcoholics, parents who are still children?
Do you want to answer that?
And finally, in Guyana, we have enough of our professionals who are trained in genetics, even in the simpler form of genetics, much less in this advanced. I know there's a lot of questions and challenges.
You know,
where do we start?
You know, my first point is that medicine becomes a social science.
Yes.
Right? There are a lot of social issues that have public health implications. You know, and so the point is that your parents are your first teachers. But there are a lot of issues that I don't think we can solve overnight. But certainly we can take note of these things and try to correct them in every generation. You know, a lot of in molecular medicine, everything starts at the molecular level. Everything starts at the home. Right? So there are a lot of single parenting and a lot of the things. So it's an interaction of discussions. You know, I was in where was it 2 weeks ago in Boston, and there was a lady there stopped me in the streets and asked me if I want to sign a petition about abortion. You know. And so she said they have so many signatures already. And so there was also a woman who was at a conference at this. where she started a program of mothers, you know, in the US, in Boston, where in terms of the environment, I'm sure you aware that there are behaviors in other areas which can be applicable. You know, where and she has created a network of mothers, you know, to promote good behavior with respect to the environment. So I think our society has changed. The society that I knew, that I grew up as a kid, is not the same society. It has changed dramatically. And so I think we need to go back to use modern, you know, I mentioned, you know, becoming an advocate and see how you can network within the community. And that's one way in which we can address those. We might not be able to address all, but certainly we can make a difference, you know, but at least we have to start. So that's a general question and response I've given to the number of questions you have. In terms of time, yeah, but I'm certainly hoping to help.
Did you have a brief question?
Yeah, just a small comment, maybe. I think that looking for a genetics of suicide as such hasn't really worked very well. We haven't found a gene after so many years, but what an area of genetics that's really gone forward, I'd like to know what you think, is the association between trauma and genetics and impulsive self-destructive behavior through microRNA, RNA molecules that translate the traumatic experience or early adversity into behaviors that are very much connected with suicide. So these molecules are some things that can be looked at in blood samples. In terms of prevention, and look, as someone mentioned before, where should we put the efforts in prevention? So just as an idea, which probably is a bit way out, if we could look for microRNA related to impulsivity and suicide, and there's several good candidates. And then those children who become adverse, who have been adversely treated, they would be good candidates for extra special attention.
You know, my short response to that is a molecular basis for everything. Everything that happens to us is a molecular basis. You know, and once we agree on that, and we know there's a molecular basis, we can deal with the environmental factors, which we have no control over the molecular changes, but we can certainly have control over the environmental.
So, yes, in the interest of very briefly.
Yes, the risk that is there when children, their parents die from homicide, is it independent of psychiatric diagnosis?
Yes, it is independent.
When the suicides are.
Yeah, but they actually saw that the parents who died from suicide, the offsprings were more likely to commit suicide as against parents who died from other things, saying that a suicidal parent will more likely to have a suicidal offspring.
Independent of psychiatric diagnosis.
Independent.
And I wanted to know, is there any study that showed the role for social learning in counteracting the genetic predisposition that people might have?
Sorry, can I ask you to take this offline?
Yeah, we can go offline because time is going, and I guess we need to.
We are going to go
Dr.
over.
Lee.
We know we started 15 minutes.
Dr. Lee has to take over. Thank you very much.